Zombies don't eat brains. Not really, only in a couple movies, but our brains like to eat zombies. Can I say that? That's kind of weird. We do, and I'm interested in why we do and what we can learn about that. This gray line, gray matter line, is all the zombie movies ever made, graphed out in terms of number. The high point there in around 2008 is about 30 zombie movies a year. So that's a lot. We're kind of at the sort of peak of zombie movies. We're sort of tailing out of the zombie outbreak. And I'm interested in what that means. What can we learn from these movies? What can we learn from what they are and what they have? What do we love? What do we fear? What do we hate? And I'm interested in what we can learn from popular culture about ourselves. And today I want to talk about zombie movies. And I can learn a lot about zombies, and you can learn a lot about zombies, but in about 5 minutes we're going to talk about one thing. We're going to talk about where zombies come from in these movies. And if you look at this line, there are certain times in which the zombies are caused by events in the film. Sometimes they're not. In 1957, in The Zombies of Morital, the zombies for the very first time show up with no cause at all. But sometimes they have a cause, and when that cause happens, it means something. And this purple line are the number of these zombie films that had a cause and of a particular kind. The first one, you could probably guess what it is. It's voodoo. A book is published. People think about voodoo for the first time in the United States, and the voodoo zombie becomes something that's part of the monster movie cycle of the 1930s. But if you look at that purple line, it stops connecting with the gray line. It stops mattering. And so for a period of time, you have the voodoo zombie. But the voodoo zombie largely goes away. After World War II, we are afraid of other things. We have another set of fears that takes over the percentage of zombie movies. If you look at 1952, this green line begins to be almost every zombie movie. So what are we afraid of in 1952 that we weren't afraid of in 1932? Aliens. Absolutely aliens. In 1952 in July, there were more than 100 UFO sightings in Washington, D.C., including alleged video of UFOs flying over the White House. So people are petrified of aliens. And of course, the zombies of the 50s are created by aliens. And so here we have zombies shifting from voodoo, something that we understand or we think we know, to all of a sudden them becoming this metaphor for some other thing that we're afraid of that we can't quite understand and can't talk about in polite society. So we see the films becoming something else. What else do they become? As you can see, the alien zombies no longer matter to us after about 1960. So what are we afraid of in our zombie movies in the 60s? Well, this teal line or blue line explains some of those things for us. And as you can see, it repeats over and over again that these things that we're afraid of starting in the 1960s, we're afraid of again in the 70s and again in the late 80s. So what's bothering us? This is the atomic blast in Nagasaki, beginning the Cold War, beginning the fear of nuclear destruction, which we process in a variety of other films in the 50s, starting with Godzilla and moving on to a series of other atomic monster movies that reigned in the cinemas in the 1950s. Our fear of nuclear weapons, while the zombie movies were about aliens, were processed with these giant monsters. Of course, things change. And by the 1960s, these nuclear monsters become lovable heroes who have to use their nuclear superpowers to experience teen angst and save the world. But the Cold War is not over. And so if you're a child of the 70s or the 80s and you're nervous about the Cold War but can't talk about it, where are you going to experience that anxiety? Because there are nuclear tests, 100 of them in the 1950s alone from the United States, and you're ducking and covering under your desks, hoping that will save you from nuclear blasts. So where does that fear show up? It shows up in nuclear zombie movies. But that's not all. There's a series of other things that we're afraid of in the middle part of this century, including thalidomide with the feet. We're talking about the beginning of the organic farming movement in the 70s as people are afraid of pesticides in your food, toxic waste spills, environmental disasters. All of these things you would think would be separate, but that blue line says otherwise. We don't have nuclear zombies and chemical zombies. For most of these movies, they're nuclear and chemical zombies, which means that as a culture, we've decided there's something called science, and we're afraid of it, and it makes zombies. Of course, if you look closely at that middle section of science, there's this like vampire fang looking thing that shows that the science zombie is not the only explanation. So what else are we afraid of in the 70s that science doesn't cover to explain those pieces? That's this white line. What is the white line? What are we afraid of in the 70s? I would pause for a dramatic effect, but this is supposed to be a 7-minute lecture, not a 27-minute lecture. So we're afraid of God, Vatican II in 1966 changes the nature of Catholicism. You have Time magazine with God is Dead and the rise of sort of consciousness of American atheism. You've got a variety of these movies about having sex with Satan and Satan babies and possession with Satan, and Charles Manson is allegedly the Antichrist murdering people in the Hollywood Hills. So we're afraid of religion. And the zombies of the 70s, when they aren't scientific zombies, are zombies from Satan, sometimes zombies from God, taking us over. And so if you look at this as a map of things we're afraid of, that's kind of a lot of stuff. But let's talk about now. What about this giant spike of zombie movies that we experience today? What do they mean and why are they there? One of the things you'll notice is this spot here after 9/11 when zombie movies almost disappear. Only 4 of them were made in 2002. Perhaps it's because we decided there were other things to be afraid of. But the Cold War was processed through zombie movies. Why is terrorism not processed through zombie movies? And it's not. Only one movie in the last 15 years has had zombies that were created by terrorists. We're processing our fear of terrorism in other ways, Jack Bauer and 24 and all kinds of other things. I think that's because zombies always win. And we don't want the terrorists to always win. So we need zombie movies to do something else. But what you see here is an entirely different field. If we're no longer processing our greatest fear through zombie movies, what are we doing in the zombie movies? We're doing this. These are fast zombies. Innovated in 2002, a new way of being afraid of zombie movies. What causes the zombie movies of the last decade? Something that maps with fast zombies. Disease, infection. How do you explain how something that was a dead, shambling corpse can now be fast and run after you? Well, if it has super rabies and it's alive, that would explain it. So we've moved from a period in which zombie movies were used as a central aspect of American fear and has transitioned into they're simply something to innovate, a new kind of monster. Because if you look here, these are previous times in which we were petrified of various diseases, polio outbreak, AIDS, the first Ebola outbreak, and there's no zombie movies to show us that we're afraid of those things. We're not that afraid of infection. Not enough to make movies about it, but we use infection because it's convenient. So let's wrap it up in terms of what we can learn from these sort of phases. If you look at this, you've got a center of the century where zombie movies are what we're afraid of. It's how we process the things that we can't talk about in polite society. But at the beginning and now today, zombie movies are something else entirely. Zombie movies are a kind of cultural and aesthetic expression that instead of being an effect of cultural anxiety, maybe are a cause of cultural anxiety. And I wonder what would happen next. We could do all sorts of things by doing this. We could talk about zombies as social critique, zombies that are people too, zombie comedies, zombies in the military, zombie movies with female protagonists. We could talk about a lot of different things and trace a lot of different cultural factors, but you have to take my class to do that. But last and least are zombies that eat brains. It doesn't happen that much, only Return of the Living Dead. So even though zombies don't eat our brains, we certainly like to consume the zombies, and I wonder what we're going to do with them next.